Eu quero começar agradecendo fortemente, né, a presença do professor Peter Bohmer aqui, né, que esteve aqui disponível para vir falar conosco essa noite. E quero agradecer também fortemente, né, o professor Olympio, a Universidade Federal do ABC, que gentilmente propuseram essa parceria conosco e possibilitaram também a realização desse evento hoje. Então, obrigada aos colegas, também vários aqui presentes. É um prazer recebê-los aqui. E espero que a gente possa repetir essas parcerias outras vezes, né? E realmente agradeço a presença do Peter aqui conosco. Só antes de seguir, gostaria de só lembrar, né, a palestra do Peter vai ser em inglês. Ele vai falar pausadamente, né, já está acostumado a fazer palestras assim. E ele mesmo pediu que, caso haja alguma dificuldade, seja necessário falar um pouco mais devagar, a gente pode sinalizar. Então, qualquer dúvida, ele reiterou, né, que a gente pode eventualmente pedir o esclarecimento de qualquer dúvida. Então, eu gostaria de apresentar, portanto, o professor e ativista Peter Bohmer. Ele é professor de Economia política numa universidade pública e progressista nos Estados Unidos, chamada Evergreen State College, que é conhecida por uma abordagem inovadora do ponto de vista pedagógico, enfim, mais dialogado, né, de um processo de avaliação continuada dos estudantes, né? Então, vem dessa abordagem progressista com relação à universidade e ao caráter público também da universidade, em Olympia, Washington, né? Ele tem sido um ativista de movimentos sociais por mudanças desde 1967, né? Um ativista com engajamento em movimentos antirracistas e em movimentos de solidariedade internacional com a luta de outros povos, como o Vietnã, como os palestinos, como os centro-americanos, cubanos, venezuelanos, né? Um ativista contra o intervencionismo estadunidense nesses lugares e por justiça econômica e racial nos Estados Unidos. A tese de doutorado dele é sobre economia política do racismo, né? E, justamente por esse engajamento e por essa forte participação em mobilizações sociais, ele tem enfrentado também, há longo tempo, perseguições por parte do FBI, enfim, por parte de outros órgãos do Estado americano. Além disso, além de lecionar economia política na universidade, o Peter também leciona em projetos populares, né, leciona economia em projetos populares na comunidade de Olympia, em Washington, e em prisões também estaduais em Washington, no qual ele discute aspectos econômicos, capitalismo e a perspectiva socialista, né? Então, é um grande prazer recebê-lo aqui. E, sem mais demora, eu passo a palavra para o Peter. Só lembrando que ele vai dividir a fala em 3 momentos, e no fim de cada bloco, ele gostaria de abrir esse diálogo, né? Então, ao invés de deixar as perguntas todas para o final, a proposta é, ao fim de cada bloco, abrir para uma rodada de perguntas, de diálogo, enfim, para que isso seja feito de forma mais dialogada. Certo? Thank you, Peter, for being here.
Obrigado. Obrigado pelo convite. Quero agradecer PUC-São Paulo e UFABC por organizar o evento. Estou feliz por estar aqui. I'm sorry I don't speak Portuguese. So, my thesis for tonight is the victory of Donald Trump and his administration's overt racism is very dangerous to people of the United States and the whole planet, but it's also a period of opportunity for the growth of the left and anti-racist and other social movements in the United States. So, as Tara, I want to thank, I will speak 3 different parts, and after each part, I will open up for discussions and comments, and I hope that you will learn from me, and I will also learn from you. So I also speak fast, so if I'm going too fast, go like this, and I will try to speak slower. So the 3 parts, the first part, which I will get to now, is the victory of Donald Trump as president, why, and the role of racism in his victory, and a little bit about the nature of U.S. racism today. My second part will be basically the goals of the Trump administration, what I call Trumpism, and also what the effects have been so far, 7 months in office. And the last and important part, I want to talk about some of the resistance going on and some of the possibilities for creating a better world. Okay, so first a little bit about the U.S. political economy and the Trump victory. The U.S. economy is marked by further concentration of wealth and corporate power in fewer and fewer hands. There's been a significant increase in jobs since 2011, very different from Brazil. The unemployment rate today is below the 2006-2007 rates of today it's down to 4.4%. Although many people have given up looking for work and are not considered unemployed. Wages of workers, although growing slightly for the last 3 years, are still below what they were before the 2008 financial crisis. Profits have more than restored and are growing. So we're living in a period, it's not a crisis for capital, but it's still a period of increasing inequality of income and wealth in the United States, similar to what it was in the 1920s, and higher than any period since the 1920s. Profits are rising rapidly once again. The Black, Latino, and Native American or American Indian families, their incomes are 2/3 to 3/4 of white families. And they have poverty rates 2 to 3 times higher than whites. Somewhat similar to Brazil, the situation of Black and white Brazilians. Although there are many poor whites in the United States, especially in small towns and rural areas. We're now in a period of economic stagnation or slow economic growth, but not recession or economic depression. Sadly, capital is winning the class war right now in the United States. So let me turn now to the elections, okay? Why did Trump win? Most people thought he had no chance. So just a little bit of background. The Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, she won 3 million more votes than Trump. She had 3 million more votes than Trump. But in the United States, the election results are determined by a system. Whoever gets the most votes in each state, they win what's called the electoral votes. And the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, he won the Electoral College, even though he had 3 million less votes, and became president January 20th, 2017. The Republicans, which are the more right wing of the 2 major parties, both were very pro-capitalist, the other one being the Democrats, control both of the Congress, the Senate, and most state governments. Okay, so that's what happened first. In terms of the votes on January 20th, Trump got 27% only of the votes of those over 18. Hillary Clinton got 29%. 40% of the people didn't vote at all. So 40% didn't vote. Why did Trump win? I don't know, he's, as probably people know here, he's kind of an authoritarian businessman, a billionaire. Actually, he had very little corporate support before the election, and he ran as an anti-establishment populist, which had some appeal. Clinton, to many people, represented the corporate establishment in a period of increasing loss of legitimacy of the government, of corporations, a period in the United States of economic and political polarization, but also of possibility. She was a very weak candidate for 2016. There was not, as some people say, a major change of the population, in terms of how they voted. For example, Trump continued to have 80% support, as did Republicans before, from white evangelical Christians. So white evangelical Christians, which is an important part of the U.S. population, 80% voted for Trump, and they're very much in the Republican Party. The vice president, for example, the current vice president, Michael Pence, is a right-wing evangelical Christian who believes Christians should run the world. There were gains by Trump compared to past recent elections among whites with no college degree, but often from areas in economic decline, areas we call deindustrialization. Okay, so he won, it was close. For example, black voters voted over 90% for Clinton, but less blacks voted in 2016 had voted for Obama in 2008 and 12. Racism is an important factor of Trump's victory, although not full explanation. Some people deny racism, but it was clearly a factor. For example, Trump had very small support from Latinos. Maybe 25% of Latinos voted for him, and especially low from blacks, as I mentioned, but they've also faced, like white workers, severe problems such as gentrification, declining unionization, declines in public services, stagnant falling wages. Many whites in the United States, although less than a majority, they fear the change in the country to a majority non-white one by the early 2040s. So most polls argue in 25 years, the majority of people in the United States will not be of European background. And many white people are very, very afraid of that, particularly older people. Trump also did better among men than women, but surprisingly, among white women, he still got slightly more votes than Clinton, although his physical assaults on women were very public and he sometimes bragged about them. Make America Great, which was a slogan, Make America Great Again, to many people, particularly whites, meant not only family wage jobs and, quote, the American dream of getting ahead, but also it meant, unfortunately, white and male dominance, like in the 1950s, and the fear of multiculturalism. Trump played into this enough to win. The Republican Party has for a long time supported racist policies, such as making it more difficult for black and Latinos to vote, promoting law and order, and mass incarceration. There are over 2 million people in prison in the United States today. Attacks on social programs that disproportionately benefit blacks, such as medical care for the poor. Many Democrats, like Bill Clinton, have also supported this, but not as extremely as Republicans. Many supporters of Trump, they're not overt or open racists or white supremacists, but sadly are indifferent or oblivious or don't care to a campaign or today a presidency that openly attacks Muslims, immigrants from Mexico and Central America, that supports giving more power to the police and letting the police do whatever they want even more than before. Many of these people, I said, who supported Trump believe that we live in a society that is post-racist, that racism exists in the past, but not today. They talk about the U.S. being a colorblind society, and they're not sympathetic to movements that make immigrant rights or police brutality against African Americans or other people important. This racist ideology of colorblindness considers movements and demands for racial equality illegitimate or demands for undeserved advantages while they're really asking for equality. Two more notes on the 2016 election, and then I'll open it up for discussion a little bit. An important note on the election of 2016 and since, there was a Democratic Party candidate named Bernie Sanders, and it was a very significant. He'd been an independent senator, one of the few independents in the U.S. Senate from Vermont. He's an ex-socialist and an honest social democrat. By social democrat, I mean somebody who wants to reform capitalism to regulate it, but still is not socialist. But Sanders is very pro-worker, and he's not controlled by corporations. He tapped very strongly into a very pro-worker and progressive discontent in the United States that's major, and the legacy really influenced a lot, both by the 2007 economic collapse, but also the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement, when people occupied cities all over the country with a demand to make the U.S. more equal, the 99% against the 1%. Sanders ran in the Democratic Party primary, so he's not been a Democrat. He got 13.5 million votes, over 40% of the vote, in spite of the active opposition by all the Democratic Party leaders. Many of those 13.5 million people who voted for Sanders are active in the ongoing protests against Trump and are the base of organizations trying to reorient the Democratic Party, other major party, away from a neoliberal perspective to progressive one, and also active in many growing left organizations, which I'll talk about later. Sanders helped legitimize ideas by talking about them, like he talked about political revolution and socialism, even though he's neither a revolutionary nor a socialist, but he used these words a lot, so they became more popular. He has formed an organization since called Our Revolution that's mainly electoral. A weakness of the Sanders campaign, even though he got almost as many votes as Clinton in the primaries, he was much weaker among African Americans and Latinos, although he had a support by the majority of young Latinos. By Latinos, I mean people of Latin American background, mainly Mexican and Central America, but also would include Brazilian, Colombian, etc. He did have a majority of support among young Latinos and a lot of support among younger blacks. Sanders, I believe, he had gotten a Democratic nomination, and there was a lot of kind of things the party did to prevent him from getting it. I believe he would have beaten Trump for president if he had run. For example, I know in my own family some relatives who said they'd voted first for Sanders in the primaries. When he didn't get it, then they voted for Trump, which was very sad to me, but that's common. There was a lot of enthusiasm, particularly among young people, for Sanders, very little for Clinton. Sanders, if he had been elected, he wouldn't have challenged the U.S. role of being the head of the U.S. of the empire. He's not anti-imperialist, unfortunately, but he is progressive, and so I think it would have been a big step forward. A final point in this introduction: even though we have, maybe the most right-wing president we've had, even though it's hard because, Reagan, Nixon, Bush, it's quite a group of criminals who've been president of the United States. But in any case, the U.S. population, maybe not in vote, has been moving to the left politically, especially younger people. And you can look at some of the polls that have been made. For example, the majority of the population supports universal health care for everybody, including immigrants. Stopping climate change is a major priority. Significantly raise the minimum wage. Free higher education, higher tax on the wealthy, full rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans people, LGBT, and also full reproductive rights. Those are majority positions and growing. People under 30 and African Americans as a whole, when asked, prefer socialism to capitalism, even though the idea of socialism is vague. So anyway, this is my introduction. What I'd like to do now is stop for questions and comments, maybe for like 15 or 20 minutes. I'll take a few questions down, and I don't know, if the questions are in Portuguese, maybe you could help, or somebody could help me to understand. I can speak Spanish too, but I do not speak Portuguese. So let's open. I will have a few questions. It can be a comment. It doesn't have, if there's something you would like to add or any question, I will take a few down and then I will try to answer them.
Bom, obrigada pela introdução. Vamos seguir a proposta do Peter.
Hi, it's two questions about related to Bernie and your opinion on him. Firstly, do you think if Sanders had gone to the second part of the election, he would have won against Trump?
Okay.
And the other is, do you think the fact that he identifies himself as a social democrat got in the way of him going to winning the primaries, because historically the U.S. has a bad relation with socialism.
Okay, so the first question, do I think he would have won? I couldn't. Maybe say the second question a little bit louder if you can. What was the second one? The second question.
If you think the Sanders identifying himself as a social democrat got in the way of him winning the primaries, as socialism is, even the idea of being socialist is considered it's
Okay.
like not really well seen in the U.S.
Okay, so the idea of social democracy in the United States versus socialism, is that the social democracy versus socialism? Is that the question? No.
If you think like that, because Sanders put himself as social
Socialist.
democrat,
Okay.
that was the problem to win the primary.
Okay. 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 Yeah, I'll take a few more.
Okay, so my question is, earlier on you mentioned that Trump was able to win the general election with few support from blacks, Latinos, non-white women, and it was all because of the electoral college. So could I infer that there is something that would, I don't know, enable whites in again, how can I say, the system of the electoral college? Would it be a system that was somehow designed to enable whites over minorities when they vote?
Okay, that's good. Okay, very good question. Thank you.
Hi.
Let's do two more. Okay.
Okay. So, what do you think will happen, like, on the next election? Will America, like, all these things that are happening, will lead to a more like left-wing candidates, or do you think that the American people will end up voting, for example, for Joe Biden? That I think.
Right. Okay.
My question, I think the most important thing, you think about population moving to the left, is when you explain that Bernie Sanders didn't got the votes, didn't got support of the blacks and the Latinos. So that's very strong, this weakness. That's very clear to everybody. And I want you to explain this better.
Okay.
Why? And is there any possibility that this changes? And how did Bernie try to change this? Or is it has it to do with his personality? Has it to do with whatever? Because at the same time you explained that 90% of the black and Latinos voted for Democrats. So apparent conclusion might be they vote for Democrats who support the establishment. But I don't think that that's the right conclusion. So.
Okay. Okay, good. Okay, good.
I would like to question about.
Is it on?
I would like to question about the role played by Tea Party. If it's possible to trace the problem of whiteness in the United States to Tea Party in the age of Obama administration. So people talk about, Donald Trump, how Donald Trump explored the whiteness during the American elections. But I think that the Tea Party, the leadership of Tea Party, they talk about the problem of taxes, the big size of states. But for someone who understands the dynamics of race relations, you can identify, the coded racist statements of the leaders of the Tea Party. So how the Tea Party is important to understand the big picture in the United States.
Okay. Great, so I will try to answer some of these questions. Some maybe I'll get to later in the talk. So, I'm trying to think about maybe I'll do them in order. That's the easiest for me. So the first question, right? And your questions, they're very connected, right? Would Sanders have won? You know, we never know. It's kind of a thought experiment, right? And so there's no clear answers. What I was trying to say in the talk, there's really growing feeling among people, all race ethnicities, of kind of a anger at what's going on, dissatisfaction. But, you know, many people, their causes are not so clear. What are some of the causes, right? So, you know, the right wing will say, you know, your problems, they're caused by immigrants, right? Or they're caused by black people, they're caused by, you know, LGBT, you know, so on. So, and then, you know, the left will say it's the corporations maybe. But I think there's really a growing dissatisfaction. That's why I mentioned the example of some cousins who, they're not conscious at all in my family, who supported Sanders, and then they voted for Trump. And it's very sad because they're of Mexican background, and it was very sad that they could vote for someone like Trump, but they said he's against the establishment. So, and at Clinton, there was almost no enthusiasm for her, you know, so that's why I think he would have had a good chance. Now, whether Sanders had won, you know, the United States, a very big religion has been, maybe besides Christianity, you know, anti-communism. Now they call it anti-terrorism, but anti-communism has been such a part of the official religion of the United States. And so if Sanders had been the candidate, they would have used it very much, he's a communist. You know, even Clinton used it against him in the primaries in Florida. He talked about Sanders supporting, you know, Fidel Castro in Cuba, supporting the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And Sanders did it one time. He's moved from more being a socialist to a social democrat, even though he uses the word socialist. But to me, socialism means where the workers' communities control society. So he didn't really believe in that. He believed more like a New Deal and so on. So I do think the ideas he had, though, really are very similar to the majority of people. So I do think he would have won. I'm not sure. It would have been a very, very vicious campaign, but I think he would have had a good chance. And he was interesting. He raised a lot of money in the campaigns by small donations. He had many donations. His average one was $30. You know, Clinton mainly and Trump had much bigger ones, but he had so many small donations. I think he would have won, but again, I'm not sure. And I think there's enough, like I mentioned on some of the issues, there's enough change in the population, like I believe, for example, in universal health care or $15 an hour minimum wage. Those positions are very popular. And the anti-corporate part, I think, was popular too. Okay, so anyway, that's my thoughts briefly on that one. So the Electoral College, the question about that, it was set up very overtly back at the time of the American Constitution to support slavery and white supremacy, because in the original setting up the Electoral College, slaves were counted for the Elect College for the number of votes each state had of 3/5 of a human being. I mean, really disgusting. So it was set up originally so that even though blacks couldn't vote, the states that had a large black population were given more votes in the Electoral College. So the original reasons were totally around supporting racism and slavery. The system today, I think it would be much better if you just had votes being counted. And it's true, in 2000, the Democratic Party candidate Gore, who ran against George Bush, he had more votes, but he lost the election, even though there was a lot of cheating and fixing of the votes too. And again, I mentioned with Clinton, it does tend to give small states more effect. But what happened in 2016, Trump won many states by a very small vote, like in the Midwest, some of the industrial states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and for example, Clinton won California by over 4 million votes, but it didn't matter that she won by 4 million, and then some states, Trump wins by a few thousand. So anyway, the original factor was definitely very much to support the power of the slave holders. Okay, the next election, yeah, I didn't bring my crystal ball, so I'm not sure. You know, I don't know exactly what will happen. I mean, you know, the Democratic Party is, including, you know, tied to your question, including Obama, I consider them neoliberal. In other words, by neoliberal, really this idea of global capitalism, capital moving around the world, basically supporting corporations. That's sort of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And as I was going to say in my next part, I'll say it now, sadly, most of the Democrats today, their big thing is, oh, that the Russians worked with Trump to fix the elections. And I think that has some value, but rather than talking about the needs for health care, the need for stopping climate change, the need for people having a living wage, being able to work less hours, they focus so much on just this thing with the Russians and Trump, which I think missing some really important issues. So I don't really know what's going to happen, but unfortunately, the Democratic Party to me is very much right now a party of the corporations. It's friendlier, you know, it's not exactly the same as Republicans, but both parties are very pro-corporate, pro-capitalist, and we need something very, very different. The system in the United States makes it very hard for third parties to develop, and maybe we can talk about that more. So I don't know, with Joe Biden, I mean, right now Trump wouldn't have a chance to win, but you know, it's hard to say what will happen. There's votes for the Congress in 2018, and right now, as I said, Republicans control the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the presidency. So maybe that will change some in 2018. Okay, in terms of the Black Latino vote, okay, the reason I mentioned that both Black and Latinos voted overwhelmingly against Trump, because some commentators argue it wasn't racism that white people voted for Trump. And I'm saying it wasn't just racism, but clearly racism is very, very important, because Black, Latino are suffering, in fact, even more from some of the economic problems than white people are suffering, but still very few voted for Trump. So that's why I was saying that racism is certainly a factor. I think of the support for Trump, some are maybe half of his voters are really very openly racist, but for many others, like I was trying to say in my talk, they don't really care. They don't really think racism an issue, so they may not say, you know, we believe in building a wall along the border, which Trump has proposed, to build a wall between Mexico and the United States, you know. But they don't really care about it, which to me is very, very depressing too. So in terms of, you know, the question about the two parties, it's very interesting, you know, for example, with African Americans, because the Democratic Party really was the party of slavery, you know, during the 1860s of the South. After the 1930s, blacks who could vote had been mainly Republican, switched to mainly Democratic Party. And, you know, the leaders of within the, like in the South of the United States, most of the people who are Democrats are black, not white, because almost all the whites are Republican. So it's true that black people have been very much in the Democratic Party, and Latinos also, but I think it's also true. I try to say, if you look at most issues, again, I'm not wanting to romanticize black people around health care, views on capitalism, rights to a job, tax on the wealthy. Blacks tend to be much more progressive than whites, including issues like abortion, reproductive rights. Latinos are also more progressive than whites, particularly on economic issues, not so much on social issues. So I think but I think we do need either a total change in Democratic Party, which I don't believe is that likely, but some of the sadness people are trying, or a totally new party, which so far the attempts have not been so successful. Okay, I think I'm going to go on now. It's okay, my second part. Okay, so my second part, again, I will talk again for about 15 minutes, and it's basically about the objectives of Trump and what's happened after 7.5 months in office. So what's been happening in the US for the last 7.5 months? Here I'm going to focus mainly from the top, what's been happening in terms of policy. In my last section, which I'm looking forward to, I will talk what's more happening from the movements from below. So, although corporate America, the very large corporations, most supported Hillary Clinton over Trump, nevertheless, Trump's commitment to lower corporate taxes, to lower taxes on the wealthy, to cut government regulations, has gained him corporate support since November. Also, Trump ran a campaign very much of what you call economic nationalism, to bring jobs back to the United States, and he campaigned very much against international trade deals like the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and another one called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He campaigned against them, and maybe he wants to protect more U.S. industries, but to me, the main thing of global capitalism is he supports the unrestricted movement of capital, of money, of finance across borders. For example, all the big banks like Santander you have here, he very much supports the right of capital to make money all over the world, no matter what the human costs are. So to me, economic nationalism, was part of his appeal, but it's really more rhetoric than reality. It's just not really so much what he's trying to do. The base of the Trump administration, I would say an increase what I call extractionism. Extractionism meaning very much seeing key of taking minerals like gold and oil out of the earth to mine them, to produce them. So very much he's for building pipelines to move oil across the world, supporting coal production, even though coal is so bad for the environment, for the workers to produce coal. So for example, the coal and oil industry, they strongly support Trump. And for example, the Secretary of State, like the Secretary of Foreign Relations, Rex Tillerson, was the head of ExxonMobil, the largest oil company before. And Trump has also appointed people who deny climate change, lobbyists from the energy companies, such as, for example, Scott Pruitt, who's now head of the Environmental Protection Agency, who's doing a lot of damage. They're very much in key economic government positions. Very dangerous in terms of, look, for example, at the devastation you may have been seeing about Hurricane Harvey, in Houston, and the Environmental Protection Agency, they had just ended, for example, regulations saying new buildings and roads have to consider the climate implications of what they're doing. The Trump administration have withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accords. Two of the biggest environmental movements and native movements in the United States over the last few years have been against the Dakota Access Pipeline, a pipeline going through the Sioux reservations, and the Keystone XL pipeline that was starting in Canada and going to the Gulf of Mexico. And I'll talk about this. So that he's given okay to these drillings, even though the majority of people are very much against it. Thirdly, we've seen a further privatization, both promoting it and also doing it. For example, a lot of public parks, some of the land is being sold, opening the lands like the public parks to drilling for oil, for other things like that. I already mentioned the proposed building, which he has not been able to pull off, building a wall with Mexico, but who would build the wall would be his friends, the private corporations. They would be given the contracts to build the wall. It wouldn't even be done by the government, but they'd be given contracts to private corporations to building it. He has proposed, and he's done a little bit of this, ending all support for public radio and public television for the arts, further supporting the corporatization, the privatization of the internet, the growth of private prisons. There are already many prisons for profit in the United States, basically a new form of slavery, but he's proposed increasing the private prisons, and the corporations who are building the private prisons, like Geo Corporation, the value of their stock has almost doubled since his election. Okay. Fourthly, proposed to turn back the limited reforms. Under Obama, there were some reforms limited in more access to health care environmental regulations, worker health and safety, consumer protection from finance, capital. So he's trying to do that to defend Planned Parenthood, defund Planned Parenthood, from which provides birth control, information and service for women's reproductive rights, lower tax on the wealthy and corporations, which will further increase the already obscene inequality of income and wealth in the United States. The United States is not quite as unequal as Brazil, but it's getting very, very close to that right now. So far, because of divisions among Republicans, although they control both branches, these policy proposals have only happened to a limited degree. But there have been reactionary changes, such as I have already mentioned, ending getting environmental regulations, which the president can just do. Another example, like Trump did about 3 weeks ago, he outlawed transgender people in the military. And again, it was just a way of trying to build support among reactionaries. So it said everybody who's in the military who's transgender would be kicked out and nobody could be in it. Fifth, and this is, I think, really worrisome, a really increase in militarism. Many top people in the government today under Trump are from the military, far more generals than the norm. There's a real danger of a war, even a nuclear war with North Korea or with Iran. Some of his advisors are pushing for it. Also increasing rhetoric against China. Military threats against Venezuela. And although there are real economic problems in Venezuela, it's far less repressive and more democratic than many US allies, such as Saudi Arabia and Israel. And Venezuela, you know, they have an elected government. There wasn't a coup like the coup in Brazil against Dilma Rousseff, but the United States doesn't talk about invading Brazil because it's more powerful. But the Venezuelan threats are also really criminal. US wars, this major killing of civilians, again, you probably don't know much about it, it's hardly in the US media. Tens of thousands of people have been killed in the last 7-8 months from US bombings of civilians in the war against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So killing of civilians in this war against the Islamic State with really no regard for civilians. Under Obama, there was very little regard also, but even some of the restrictions Obama had about bombing, they've been reduced with the Trump administration. You know, Obama waged war in at least 5 countries I could think of in writing this, but those wars are even escalating under Trump. 3 US generals are leaders of the government, the head of the Defense Department, the National Security Advisor, and the Chief of Staff. A friend of mine, just a day before I came here, he was saying, you know, there's been a military coup in the United States. And he was saying, maybe some country should invade us because we've had a military coup. We always talk about invading countries with a military coup. So I'm also afraid that Trump, to gain support from his base, could begin a war. And this very much needs to be opposed. And sadly, right now, the anti-war movement in the United States is very weak. Okay. 3 more factors on this in terms of some of the policy. There's, as I already kind of hinted at, there's really an attempt to restrict and demonize immigrants, to restrict and demonize, to make immigrants seem evil, particularly Latinos. I said mainly those from Mexico and Central America, and also Muslims from all over the world. There are 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, so roughly 11 million people in the United States don't have legal papers. And 3/4 are Mexican or Central American. There's also, by the administration and the right-wing media, a demonizing, a kind of making bad, evil, the black community, or most of the black community, as violent, criminal, dangerous, and responsible for their own poverty. His calls for law and order to me is coded racism. It's just a way of, it's really racist, but it's like not saying it very openly. We have now, you know, increased deportations. Deportations of people, particularly Latin Americans, is increasing. There's a lot of pressure being put by the Trump administration, particularly by the Attorney General, putting pressure on police and courts to work more directly with the system of deportation and to work with the immigration police, they called ICE. And you had, for example, just a few days ago, the pardoning of a really disgusting, racist, and hated Latino immigrants, the ex-sheriff from Phoenix, Arizona, Joe Arpaio, who openly broke the laws in arresting, brutalizing Latino immigrants in Arizona and Phoenix. He'd been elected sheriff many times, finally got defeated as the population in Phoenix is changing to a large Latino. And but anyway, Trump, a few days ago, just again to gain support among his base, he pardoned Joe Arpaio, who had been a big supporter of him. There's an increased fear among immigrants in the United States and a danger of a major increase in deportations. Obama deported over 1 million people, so again, I don't want to praise him too much, but there's been increased deportations of people who, let's say, get caught driving without a license. Like, often if you don't have a legal documents, you can't get a driver's license. You get stopped then. And with Obama, often they would not be deported, but people who are getting stopped for minor infractions like driving without a license or being drunk are increasingly being deported. And even with no crime at all, are increasingly being deported since Trump was elected. And he's very likely, there's a program now that allows people who came here when they were young, who went to school in the United States, to stay. And it seems very possible, it's called DACA, D-A-C-A, that Trump's going to end this program. About 800,000 people now have the right to stay and work and go to school, even though they don't have documents. The courts so far have limited its anti-refugee agenda, barring everyone from 7 Muslim countries. So what are the reasons for this anti-immigrant and anti-refugee policy and rhetoric? I think basically both he's very ignorant, but also I think appealing to a white base whose economic problems he cannot and will not solve. So I think because he cannot solve the economic problems, he's trying to gain support this way. Okay, briefly, 2 more things. The Trump administration, I call Trumpism, clearly wants to destroy public sector unions, unions of government workers. The private sector in the United States is already down to only 7% union membership. It was, in the 1960s, it was over 30%. It's down to 7% of the private sector. Most of the economy is in only 7% unions. The public sector, the government workers, still over 1/3 are in unions, and they're a major source of money for the Democratic Party, but it's really a major attack on the public sector unions by the administration and by the Supreme Court. So I think basically the Trump administration is very much trying to delegitimize further major institutions, the courts, the judiciary, the media, increasing attack on universities. Not just saying universities are, like lately he's been talking about universities not accepting enough white students, but also I think just attack on universities. The Trump administration, many of his cabinet advisors, they're openly ignoring the law. For example, they're supposed to sell off their corporate stock, even though they haven't. So I think part of this agenda of the Trump administration is increasingly authoritarian rule with many fascist elements. The idea of a charismatic leader, white nationalism, scapegoating the other, criminalizing protests, like wanting to call people who protest terrorists. So I think we really see this growth as increasingly authoritarian rule. And just 2 more comments before I get to possibilities, but I have a question first. So much of Trump's agenda so far, such as ending the healthcare reforms of Obama, they have not consolidated. He has not been able to get away with all of them. There's a lot of instability. Every day there's new daily scandals, but it's a very uncertain and dangerous next few years. One success of Trumpism, which is a feat for all of us, is the appointment and confirmation of Neil Gorsuch, a very right-wing Supreme Court justice, extreme right-winger, very racist, 100% pro-corporate, which pushes the Supreme Court even more to the right. So Trump's popularity has declined. I think right now, if there was an election, it'd be a landslide. Clinton would beat him by a landslide. his poll numbers, he's historically low levels in the 30%, between 30 and 40% for president, the lowest ever after 7 months. But most Republican voters still support him. It's possible he will be impeached, meaning that the Congress could vote to get rid of him, or could resign because of his connections to the Russian government or other scandals. Although I don't think it will happen this year. If Trump leaves office, there's probably less danger of a new war, which is a good thing, a major war, but the Vice President, Pence, is a major right-winger and might be even more effective in achieving a right-wing pro-corporate agenda. So let me stop here. I've been talking again for about 15 minutes, and what I'd like to do now, before I talk about something like Charlottesville and some of the possibilities of the future, anything about the agenda, what's happened so far, what are some of the policy changes. I'll take a few questions, answer them, and then get to my main part. Where are we at today, both the movements, but also the dangers of fascism and white supremacy.
Vamos repetir a dinâmica inicial. Temos uma aqui, outra lá.
Well, good night. I'd like to know your opinion about Trump's actions. He's a public figure. He's a polemic one. And you talked that for gaining support, normally he shows some opinions and kind of runs from the economic problems, right? So I'd like to know, how do you think that it affects the society actions? Because as a polemic figure, he kind of may influence how some people that support him behave. So what do you think it may cause?
So why the economic question? Why people support the economic?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. Eu também acho que eu não entendi também, but you were saying
I think I understand. Maybe in Portuguese, then yeah.
porque ele é uma figura pública. Sim. Das sociedades. Well, as he's a public figure, his opinions are very influencing in American society. And well, since Trump has these kind of opinions, that this is really worrying that he can have this kind of influence. And
Okay.
sure,
Okay.
I think you said that you're going to talk more about that in the next part.
I think I will answer that, but I will talk about that more in the next section. But I will answer it.
Hello. I would like to question about the possibility. I would like to question about the possibility of transcending the bipartisan model in the United States, since in the last election we have seen bigger participation of parties, that third parties, like Green Party with Jill Stein campaign, and if there is a possibility of a movement that is not focused on elections, but since you have talked about Occupy Wall Street, if there is a movement that's not focused on electoral politics, but that can have a base and change politics in the United States.
Yes, I will wait. Sorry, that will be my next section, because I'm very much believe elections are only a very, very small part of politics. To me, politics is really building movements below, not merely electoral. But I will get to that more in my next section for sure.
Desse lado aqui ainda não peguei nenhuma agora, depois aqui. Aqui.
My question is about healthcare.
Yeah.
And how does Obamacare influence, and what's its impact in Trump's election and government, and what will happen next with this project. That's it.
So I understood. I missed the last part with Obamacare.
What was the impact in?
What's the impact of Obamacare? And okay, good.
Yeah.
I would like to know about the Trans-Pacific government. Partnership. Would it be possible to United States going back to the whole partnership, and what, like Trump leaving it, ended up changing in the United States right now, and what it will affect in the future?
Okay.
Ali, Guilherme, depois.
Hello. I would like to know if the opposition that Donald Trump is facing now, more specifically the opposition that he's facing even by the ones who voted for him, if it comes from somehow from a disappointment on him, since some of the policies that he promised during his public speech have shown not possible actually. So I would like to know the relation between these two points.
Okay.
Thank you.
So maybe I'll do these and we have, okay. Maybe one more.
One more? Okay, so I suppose No?
Hi. My question is about the feeling that Donald Trump's speech brings to people, like about the prejudice they always support in his speech, and how that brings could bring a fight between the new left that we're talking about and the extreme right in the U.S. right now.
So maybe how? Repeat again, maybe.
I want to know how the feeling of freedom that Donald Trump brings to his prejudice speech could create a fight between the new left and the old right in the United States.
The feelings of freedom, they'll talk about freedom, right? Okay, good. Okay. Okay, so with regards to the first question, I think to understand part of the victory of Trump, the growth of both public right-wing media and social media is very important. You know, for example, the most popular cable TV show is called Fox News. And, just again, this is anecdotal, but from people I know often who supported Trump, they listen to Fox News 24 hours a day. Even when they sleep, they have Fox News on. And it's constantly against the immigration. The immigrants are taking our jobs. They're dangerous. The people who work for the environmental justice or who fight the fascists, they're terrorists. We need to have terrorist laws against them. And so I think that is very much part of the victory. And I call it Trumpism. It's much more than Trump. It's a whole administration of really authoritarian politics. And it's not only true, just as a little bit of a side, it's not just the United States. We see this very right-wing, I would say, racist populism. Populism does not have to be right-wing, but I think it has, like, blaming people with even less power, the other, right? And so he, of course, his cabinet, it's not just him, the person who's the Attorney General, Sessions, comes very much out of these white supremacist movements also, and they make those things more legitimate. So I do think that's very dangerous. I'm going to talk more about Charlottesville, but I do feel, again, some of those ideas, it's important to realize it's not a majority, it's not even a majority of white people, but it's very significant numbers of people. And so it is a very worrisome thing, and I think we need to figure out ways to challenge. I know in my own organizing, I try to separate the conservatives and the white supremacists. To me, the white supremacists are people who are really openly violent. They basically want to put black people, lesbian, gay people in concentration camps. For those, I think we do have to fight, but I think it's important sometimes in the protests I'm involved in, we treat all the conservatives the same, and I think it's important that we divide them too. Yeah, the movement about not electoral, I think that's so important, and I think most of the important movement states in the United States are not electoral. I will get to that in my final section. Okay, the Obamacare. Okay, that was the third question. So in the United States, very sadly, the system that developed after World War II is many people have health care through their jobs, not because they're residents, but through your employer. And they're set up in a way that insurance companies, the healthcare insurance companies, make billions and billions of dollars for healthcare. And in fact, these insurance companies and the big pharmaceuticals, they are some of the biggest supporters in terms of lobbyists for the Democrats and Republicans. They support both of them. What Obamacare, what they called Obamacare, he proposed in 2009 was to increase access to health care. About 20 million people more got health care, and there were two parts of it. One part, I think that was very good. There's a program for poor people, for low-income people, and he increased the number of people who get that. That's free and includes dental care also. That's called Medicaid. That was increased, but even there, even though the federal government said they would pay, many of the conservative states refused to do it, like in Mississippi and Texas, even though it would cost them no money, but they didn't want programs that would help poor people or black people. And then you had for other people who were not below the poverty line, where they would get some money so that they could afford the health care, which of course helped the insurance companies. And there was a huge campaign by the Republicans to say how this was socialism, how horrible it was. Many people didn't support it, but then what's happened since Trump won, many people who saw how they benefited from it, they very much were against changing it. And so far, he has not been able to make the changes. So again, going back to limitations of the Democratic Party, so most of the Democratic Party leaders, they're saying, we have to keep Obamacare. My position, and most people I work with, our argument, it's a very good time to talk to universal health care, that just by being a human being, you should have the right to quality health care. And I think there's majority support for that, but again, the leaders of the Democratic Party is afraid to say it because the Republicans are right, there are many problems with the Obamacare. It often costs very much money. The insurance companies are making billions, and but I think the solution is not to go back to Obamacare or keep it, even though it's better than what Trump wants to do, but to really push for a basic universal health care. The United States spends far more money than any country in the world in health care, but we have much worse health than many, many other countries of the world. Okay, so the TPP, and I will also add NAFTA. What I was trying to say, so the Trump, and this also ties maybe to the next question, that, when Trump campaigned, he said NAFTA is the worst deal ever, the North American Free Trade Agreement for Americans. To me, the problems are global capitalism. Like with NAFTA, both the Mexican and the U.S. workers both are losing out while corporate capital is gaining. And the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it was a larger agreement, included like Chile, Vietnam. I think it was a larger NAFTA. And again, to me, when Trump was saying he was against it, I think it was very easy to focus on that rather than the larger problems of neoliberalism and global capitalism. And like I said in my talk earlier, Trump isn't questioning at all the movement of capital around the world, no matter what the costs are to communities. Many of the communities of people in the Midwest, for example, who voted for Trump were communities where the jobs had left. And people actually are doing very badly, but they thought maybe he could bring back the jobs. That he promised to bring back the jobs. It's not going to happen. The jobs that were lost anyway. But that was, I think, an appeal to it. And even with NAFTA, I think what he's trying to push now is to make it better for a few U.S. corporations, and even worse for Mexico. But to me, again, you know, I do a lot of talk in the United States. I always talk, we have to see solidarity among working people around the world, that our friends should be like Brazilian workers, Chinese workers, not, you know, the U.S. companies because they waved the U.S. flag. To me, those are the enemies of people both here and there. But very much is, again, this nationalism, bringing back the jobs, stopping these treaties. But the issue of global capitalism, the power of capital, is not questioned at all. Okay. Finally, on this one, the question of freedom. That's a really interesting question. You know, how we define freedom. I think, you know, to a lot of the, I don't know, we call it in the United States libertarian. You know, libertarian in the United States is very conservative. It's kind of an idea that business should do whatever they want. Any government regulations are bad. You know, like minimum wage laws are bad. The government is a problem, and we should have the freedom to do whatever we want. It's only talking about a very limited individual freedom, but it does have some appeal. And, you know, as Noam Chomsky, you know, very famous U.S. writer, he talks about a lot what people in power want is the freedom to exploit. You know, the freedom to exploit means freedom to, you know, exploit somebody else. What about the person being exploited? So my view is this idea of freedom is very, very important, but we need to get freedom talking about freedom that's both individual and collective. You know, the needs of the collective, the needs of the commons, and individual. But this idea of the right-wing view of freedom does have some real appeal in this period. So I think rather than saying what many left people I know say, freedom is just a bourgeois term, it's a right-wing term, I think we need to define freedom of the freedom to have health care for all, to have jobs that are not alienating, to have meaningful work, to have work that is meaningful, to live in a healthy environment, to live in a world where there's no poverty and no hunger. That's, to me, a kind of freedom that I think of positive freedom, rather than freedom of the freedom that restricted to, you know, I can have 200 different cereals, but they're all exactly the same. So let me turn now, because I want to get to my last section, and hopefully we'll have a full discussion then. So, but I think before I get to it, because I've been talking for an hour, what about if everybody just stands and stretches for a minute? Okay.
Já é rapidinho, viu, pessoal? Já podem sentar de volta aí.
Okay, so this is going to be my concluding section. I'm going to have an overall discussion. So I call it Fascism and Authoritarianism, Resistance and Possibility for Radical Social Movements and the Growth of the Left. So first, and tied to one of the questions that was asked, we do see in the United States, particularly in the last, I would say, 2 years. So it precedes Trump, but it's increased since then, a growth of openly fascist and white supremacist groups. And I don't use the word fascist lightly. Sometimes, you know, people call just people are fascists, you don't like them. I'm somebody who really believes in a very totally corporate government-controlled society where people's rights and freedoms are gone. So we see in the United States a growth in membership of these fascist and white supremacist groups. Many today in the United States, they call themselves, they don't say Ku Klux Klan, even though I'll mention them, they talk about themselves as alt-right. alt-right, like alternative right, and many of the groups, some of which I've had many problems with in my life. Some of them, they used to have, for example, the swastika on their webpage. They've taken off the swastika, or they've taken off the cross of the Ku Klux Klan. They use more coded, hidden language, like white identity. They say, look, there's black identity, or lesbian identity, gay identity. We believe in white identity. They use that often rather than terms like white supremacist or white nationalist. Many of the spokespeople of these groups, they're college educated. So to me, these are basically superficial changes, but they're still white supremacists. Many are armed. Often what they've been doing in the last few years, particularly at colleges, they use the argument of free speech. They use the argument of free speech, say, we just want to give our speeches, but their speeches promote hate speech and attacks. For example, one person named Milo Yiannopoulos from the Breitbart News, which is a very white supremacist news service, a very popular one. People stopped him speaking at University of California, Berkeley, but people had found out what he was going to do was he was going to publicly announce all the students at Berkeley who were undocumented, who didn't have legal papers, which have jeopardized them very, very much. We've had also in the United States in the last 2 years an increased physical attacks, including murder on Muslims, on blacks, on Latinos, on American Indians, and Jews. And also institutions have been bombed or attacked, such as mosques and synagogues. There have also been increasing attacks on people who are, let's say, non-conforming gender. By non-conforming gender, people know what I mean, like who don't, let's say, identify with the gender they were born to. So I think these groups are really dangerous, but we shouldn't overestimate their support. They can't mobilize many people. They're dangerous physically, but I think there's a danger to overestimate the support they have. So let me just talk briefly about Charlottesville, Virginia, because I think this is a very significant event. So in Charlottesville, for about almost a year, there have been a combination of these alt-right groups that they don't call themselves Nazi or Ku Klux Klan, but they were combined with openly white supremacists such as the Ku Klux Klan, and they called for demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia, near Washington, D.C., on August 13th, almost 3 weeks ago. And they called for the demonstration to defend a statue memorializing the head of the Confederate military, Robert E. Lee, who was a general from the Confederacy. The Confederacy, just briefly, were the states in the South of the United States in 1861 who left the United States in order to preserve slavery, and they fought and lost the Civil War. So even with a major and lengthy campaign to attract pro-Confederate and racist people, these white supremacists attracted less than 1,000 people from the whole country, even though they had a lot of money, campaigns all over, and they were met by thousands of protesters, thousands of protesting, including a few hundred call themselves Antifa, who were committed to physically protecting the anti-racist counter-protests and to stop the white supremacists from speaking. The racists were so outnumbered by fact of many to one that they couldn't speak, and some of them left. But shortly after this demonstration, one of them, who had been very active in the racist protest, he drove his car into a crowd of anti-racists, injuring 19 and killing a woman named Heather Heyer, who was a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, I'll talk about, and the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, a radical union that goes back over 100 years. It was clearly, to me, an act of domestic terrorism. The United States media uses terrorism when, ISIS, drives a car into people in France or Spain or Italy, but this was clearly an act of terrorism also. So these openly racist groups, they were defeated in the streets and by large and massive protests against their attempted rallies. For example, a week later, August 20th in Boston, they called again for another rally, a group called Patriot Prayer. they had less than 100 people. Again, they tried to get from all over the East Coast, and over 40,000 Bostonians protested. They didn't even try to speak. And there was a broad coalition, which I think is very important to defeat them. Antifa, labor unions, young people and students, churches, with very multiracial protests against them. And to me, there's a real possibility of a growing anti-racist consciousness in social movements in the United States. And in this part, for any kind of change in the United States, anti-racism and leadership by blacks and other people of color are central and necessary for any transformation in the United States. I would probably think the same thing about Brazil, but I don't know so much about here. Okay, so what happened, so this happened on Saturday, the 13th of August. Right after that, Trump, both on Twitter and in a press conference, what he did was he said equally wrong were the racist groups and the anti-racists. He made equal the racist groups and the anti-racist groups in the following days after Charlottesville. And this, to me, has further isolated Trump. I mean, it's a mixed thing because it does legitimize the white supremacists, but it further isolated Trump. And even there were, for the first time, really since he's been elected, some major criticisms from within the Republican Party. So the negative thing is maybe these white nationalists or supremacists gain some support for the 20 to 30% of the population. I think that supports Trump no matter what he says. I think it's somewhere between 20 and 30% who support him no matter what he does, no matter how racist and reactionary he is. But a further alienation from the majority of people for the Trump administration. So again, his racist comments, in terms of the question, he helped legitimize white supremacists to minority white people, which is dangerous, but repulsion from these groups is also growing. So we're living in a very dangerous period in the United States. It's the growth of, I think, open, really a violent racism from both above, both in power and below. And similarly, a growth of people promoting patriarchy and male dominance from above and below. And again, tied to some of the last questions, the Trump administration is not going to deliver on the economic promise. They'd bring back jobs, they would help people, and there was a hope by many of his supporters that he would deliver on the economic promises. So to me, it's a period both of a possibility of a growth of a left and anti-capitalism, but also for Trump to keep his base, the danger of further demonization and attacks on feminists, on immigrants, and others. So the danger of a movement toward more authoritarianism, more fascism to keep its base, or also a danger of using war in a way of gaining support. So I wouldn't say we live in a period of fascism, but it is a very dangerous period. As I already mentioned in my comments at the beginning, I'll just repeat briefly, there is a movement to the left of the US population, particularly those under 30 years old, on issues such as immigration, climate change, LGBT, and also economic. The protests against this Trump agenda since January 20th have been large and continuing to keep health care, increasingly for universal health care, for climate justice, against police brutality and racism, for affordable housing for all, for living wage. So these protests are continuing. Many social movements are continuations of a growth in activism that was really growing before Trump. For example, a very significant movement was called No DAPL, No to Dakota Access Pipeline. It was a major struggle that continues, that has brought together hundreds of Native American tribes, often who haven't worked together, for issues of native sovereignty, the right to clean water, for climate justice, for those who want to stop this pipeline that would go through native land and right through the Missouri River. So this movement's been led by Native American with supporters across the U.S. For example, Olympia, where I live, there's been really direct action like stopping trains with supplies going to North Dakota, people building like barricades on the tracks in support of the movement called the No Dakota Access Pipeline. Again, the movement for climate justice and against climate change. There's been a major consciousness in the United States to understanding climate change as a major threat to survival and that major changes cannot be postponed. Probably the major issue and organizing on college campuses today, together with maybe the Black Lives Matter, is demand for universities to not have any money in fossil fuel corporations like ExxonMobil or the other ones. The horrific flooding of Houston and Texas and Louisiana in the last week will increase the strength and politics of these movements, hopefully connecting them more to capitalism as a cause. Okay, another movement that was very important before Trump and continuing is the Black Lives Matter movement. So Black Lives Matter movement began after a whole series of killings, usually by white policemen, of black people. And I actually don't think the killings have increased. That's sadly been a part of US history for the history of the United States. So I'm not sure if they've increased, but there's been more attention paid to them. And what's important with the Black Lives Matter movement is they're increasingly developing a program besides the very important one of opposing police brutality and criminal injustice, increasingly demands about anti-poverty, more employment, gender justice, immigrant justice. What's interesting, many of the black-led movements of the 60s and 70s were mainly led by black men. In the Black Lives Matter role, there's a major role of black women, including lesbian women, in the Black Lives Matter movement. I'd say it's between a network and an actual organization. And this, I do a lot of work, we can talk and question answer and doing political education in the prisons of the United States, mainly with black prisoners, and there's really strong support in prisons for the Black Lives Matter. Another important movement that, again, started well before Trump has continued is that demand for all workers be paid $15 an hour, which is really, even $15 an hour, it sounds like a lot, I know, compared to minimum wage here, but in cities like Seattle or San Francisco, if you're supporting more than yourself, you can't live on, well, the minimum wage is $7.35 nationally. So mainly it's been led by fast food workers, people who work places like McDonald's or Burger King, mainly young people, and it's been supported by a union, but often these workers have some autonomy, often very quite militant, direct action, occupying restaurants, and they've won rising wages of $15 an hour in many cities, in Seattle, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Another major movement, again, that's continuing and I think maybe growing, is against gentrification. By gentrification I mean making cities unlivable for working people because it's so expensive to live there. So against gentrification and for affordable housing and for the homeless. And this is a very big movement where I live. Every day, there are protests in support of homeless people against some of the laws against homelessness. So the limited success of these important movements, like gentrification, very, very difficult to stop, but I think they're active and continuing movements. Okay, so in the streets, let me talk briefly before I conclude about some of the protests in the streets. So the inauguration of Trump was January 20th. On January 21st, the day after the inauguration, there was a call throughout the country for a women's march. Even though men were invited to take place, it was probably 3/4 women. 4 million people took part, maybe the largest single protest in U.S. history. 4 million participants the day after the inauguration. And many of the participants were to the left, more radical than the organizers. The numbers are way beyond what anybody predicted. There were many signs and banners, not only about women's equality, for reproductive rights, but also for immigrant, racial, and economic justice. So I think that's been one very important day of protest in the streets. Very inspiring, too, was within a week of Trump's inauguration, he attempted to ban any visits or entry from people from 7 Muslim countries. The resistance to this has been major and inspirational. For example, the day he announced it, without much organization, tens of thousands of people spontaneously went to and closed the airports, like in Seattle, near where I live, in New York, in San Francisco. People closed the airports by sitting in, by blocking the airports, what I call direct action, not just asking the government to do something, but doing it directly yourself. And so far, you know, he's been unable to totally do this ban on these Muslim countries. I mentioned, you know, already in my last few minutes, the growth of movements against the white supremacists. So you also have now, and growing in the last few months, a national movement and discussion about removing racist monuments, particularly those of slave owners and those who promoted slavery and those who were very involved in the mass displacement and killing, really the genocide against indigenous people. So increasingly the debates, people are just taking these statues down, but it's led to a lot of discussion about how central racism has been to US history. There's been some decline in these numbers since the early and winter spring. So let me move to talking about the nature of some of this resistance and then make some concluding comments. So many people in these protests are very new to protests, and that's to me very exciting when you're going beyond you know, the choir. They're quite diverse racially and age-wise. There's been a large use of what I call direct action, interfering with the daily functioning of the economic and political system. So I think we're in a very, you know, interesting period. Often these protests are only about one issue, but increasingly participants are making connections between the key issues of the interconnected Trump agenda. There's also been a growth in progressive electoral campaigns inside and outside the Democratic Party, often led by the people who supported Sanders. For example, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there was an election of a DA who had represented many victims of police brutality, and his campaign was against mass incarceration. So we're seeing basically probably the largest number of people in the streets protesting since the 1970s. There's a chance of really major social movements and upheavals demanding more than just defending the Obama neoliberalism and going back to Democratic Party politics and policies. There are outrages by the Trump administration every day. For example, ending minor bank reforms, continuing attacks on women and immigrants and Muslims, on LGBT and public space to climate. So demonstrations will continue, but of course, the size is difficult to maintain. So the limitations and possibilities, now we'll close with that, the limitations and possibilities. So a major problem in the US is the lack of sizable organization with good politics. This makes it hard to sustain protests and develop a successful campaign to deepen critical analysis by participants and to connect the issues. The protests also, secondly, although very important, they're mainly defensive in nature. They're mainly like to reduce attacks on immigrants, protect, you know, abortion and reproductive rights, to protect the environment from further destruction, like against the pipelines, against police killings and police brutality. But it's mainly just to go back or to hold on to what we have. There have been a growth of left organizations. For example, Heather Heyer, the woman I mentioned who was killed, a really beautiful woman who was killed in Charlottesville by the white supremacist fascists. She was a member of DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and they've gone from 5,000 members in January 2016 when the primaries began to 25,000, an increase of 5 by August of this year. And the Democratic Socialists of America, they're increasingly moving beyond social democracy to a view of an ecological and participatory socialism based on community and work control. And they're also, their view before 2016 had mainly been to try to change the Democratic Party to be a social democratic party. Increasingly, they're discussing the idea of the importance of movements, like they're very involved in universal health care and forming a new party. There's also been a really large growth, what are called neighborhood assemblies, of people getting together in communities to like self-govern, to set up institutions, mainly anarchist, but in Seattle, near where I live, Olympia, Portland, you've really seen this growth of these neighborhood assemblies of people meeting, trying to work on many issues. So the possibilities now exist to grow and deepen social movements, especially, as I've mentioned, Trump's economic program doesn't and will not improve people's lives. We really have an opportunity today to educate and share a different analysis of the cause of economic inequality and injustice, and develop solutions and to build progressive movements, to reach out to new protesters beyond, to people who I think have the possibility of identifying as radical or anti-capitalist or left. There's no shortcuts. In conclusion, we need to connect the issues, develop a program and vision that maybe isn't fully anti-capitalist, but it's a step in that direction and speaks to climate justice, to economic equality, ending poverty, that's anti-fascist, anti-neoliberal, anti-militarist, for civil rights, immigrant, racial, gender, environmental, economic justice, that develops and wins this idea that I have called non-reformist reforms. The idea of non-reformist reforms are reforms that improve people's lives, that deepen understanding and develop a popular critique of capitalism that needs to further demands to build the capacity to further undermine and end capitalism. We need to build radical organizations deeply embedded in social movements that have an electoral component but aren't primarily electoral. In closing, I am more optimistic about the possibility of growing social movements that are increasingly anti-capitalist than I've been in many years. It's a very dangerous period, but also one of radical possibilities and liberation. The idea of liberation is in the air. Our alternatives really are destruction of much of the human race on a global level through climate change or environmental destruction of war, or a humane and ecological, feminist and anti-racist and participatory and revolutionary socialism. Power to the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this excellent lecture and for the reasons for hope that you give us with this last part, mainly about resistance. So, vamos para a nossa última rodada de questões, seguindo a mesma dinâmica.
And just maybe, questions or comments? It doesn't have to only be a question. If you want to make a comment, that's fine too.
E eu também esqueci de dizer que se alguém quiser fazer a questão em português, não tem nenhum problema, nós podemos traduzir, tem, enfim.
So I only have a brief question. It would be about the Antifa movement, because we have seen many reports about the white supremacists, the alt-right, and all of that. And it seems now, more recently, we have Antifa, and we have seen many conflicting reports, and especially some reports from the allegedly left-wing media who says they are just as bad as the white supremacists, that they are equally wrong, that they use violence and they shouldn't. But I don't think we actually know that much about them. We don't know who they are, where do they come from, why did they decide to organize, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Should I do one by one or just do a few? Let's do a few. Maybe I'll answer. Just because we have more time. Yeah, so partly joking, some of my best friends are Antifa, so I have some familiarity with them. To me, for example, they exist in Olympia. Like the college I teach in Evergreen, there was a lot of controversy, and one of these right-wing groups said they would come to the college to fight, basically against leftists. And so there was a counter-protest, and maybe there were more Antifa people there than they were of the white supremacists. So to me, they're more good than bad. It's not, I've seen, for example, I have the great respect for Noam Chomsky, who I studied with, but, he's been very critical of them. And I think the idea that you physically try to stop the white supremacists is important to defend people. I don't think it's enough. And for example, I think it's very important we connect the issues, of, inequality, of racism to other, like to capitalism. Because to me, racism is very much part of a capitalist economy, and that we try to talk to people. But again, they're one part of a movement. Like, for example, at Evergreen, when the white supremacists came, I suggested, even though it didn't happen, a very, very large protest, like I mentioned in Boston, and then also in Berkeley a few days ago, when you had the Antifa people there last weekend in Berkeley, California, but you had many other people too. So I think, to me, they're part of the movement. And again, movements have many different parts. I think if we're just fighting, it does alienate people. But if you have people explaining it, many different people, and the Antifa people, okay, from what I've seen, it's mainly younger people, more men than women, but it's not true, it's all men, and large majority white, but not all white either, mainly young, probably mainly anarchist in terms of ideology. I think among younger people in the United States who are against capitalism, you know, I very much come out of what's called the New Left, that very much saw change of people and change the world, very anti-imperialist, but not anarchist. I, for example, today have a lot of anarchist sympathies of building things that are more horizontal. I would say most of the Antifa people, if you ask them what they were politically, they would say we're anarchist. And a lot of people, you know, a lot of them are very, very thoughtful people, and the danger of like calling them terrorists, which a lot of the Republicans want to do, or like in Berkeley, the mayor, who's kind of liberal or progressive, he said that they should be called the gang, which to me is really horrible. Altogether, I think as part of a larger movement that's many different parts, pacifist, more militant, I think it's very, very important. I think we need to have many different levels of movement. And again, you know, when people compare the right and the left, think about how many people in the United States, you know, the white supremacists have killed over the last years, that Antifa's killed nobody. And I think to see them like as, you know, Trump did, to say they're equal, other people, when one is basically against racism and the other one is for racism, to me is horrible. So I do see them as positive, but not sufficient. You know, to me, one part of larger movements. Is that helpful?
I would like you to talk a little bit more about the Black Lives Matter. So
Okay.
Some policies, some actions that go beyond the protest against police brutality. And you said that today the Black Lives Matter is basically led by black women. I think it's the same for Brazil. Over 30 years ago, the most important organizations of the black movement in Brazil were led by black men, but today it's completely different. So the organizations are led by black women, and I can identify many similarities between the Black Lives agenda and the agenda of the Brazilian social movement.
Good, and I would like to learn more about the Brazilian social movements. So originally, the Black Lives Matter movement, when it first began about 3 years ago, it was in response to some really outrageous killings by the police, like in Ferguson, Missouri, but on videos that captured the killings. And the movements originally were like demanding the police be brought to justice. And also, like I was saying to some people earlier, if you look in the prisons in the United States, African Americans or black people are more than 6 times represented compared to whites. And so a lot of the Black Lives Matter was originally, you know, against the very long prison sentences, very much what I call the criminal injustice system, and against the police brutality. So that marked the first year, beginning about 2000, late 2015, mainly 2016. In the last year, programs have developed, against like ending poverty, increasing employment, access to education, some discussion about the idea, but it's not, of reparations, saying because of all the wealth stolen from slavery, there should be money, not to individuals, but to communities. For example, maybe smaller high school size, smaller sides of students, and that both the companies and the government should pay for some of that. So that isn't a part of a program, but increasingly there have been meetings among these groups that are often very decentralized around a program around economic justice, and also, to me, very exciting is the issue of immigrant justice, because often in the United States, there have been a lot of division between blacks and Latinos, even though, you know, the situation, like look at poverty rates, often very, very similar. And so increasingly within the Black Lives Matter movement in the last year or so, last year and a half, demands for amnesty for immigrants, you know, some of whom are black, like black, you know, Latino also, that they should have full rights too. And so that to me has been a very, very exciting development. Some of the Black Lives Matter movement has worked with the Democratic Party a little bit, but there's also, I think, a stronger view that we need to be independent, autonomous of any of the major parties. So I think it's a very, you know, again, that's why I said, I don't know whether I'd call it a network organization. It's really maybe more of a network, but it does seem exciting. And for example, I live near Seattle, Washington, and we just had the primary for mayor, and a woman named Nikita Oliver, who was maybe the most identified person with the Black Lives Matter movement, young woman, lawyer, a spoken word artist. She ran on a campaign for mayor, but it was movement, so it wasn't tied to any of the political parties. Well, she formed her own party called the People's Party, and she came in third. But it was a campaign very much in the black communities and immigrant communities, and it really pushed forward this platform of the Black Lives Matter campaign. My daughter was very involved in her campaign, so I got to learn very much about it. And to me, it was just many, many young people. They had so many people working, talking to people, and again, while she was running, a woman who was like, 44 kilos, a black woman who had called the police for the burglary. The police shot her 7 times and killed her, Shalina Lyles. And so Nikita Oliver made a very big campaign about the killing of this woman. The police said, you know, she had a knife, but she had called them, and she was less than half the size of the many cops who came and shot her. So making these public issues, to me, seems very important, and tying it to other issues too, like gentrification, which I mentioned. Seattle has the highest rising of rents because of Amazon and all these computer companies. People cannot live there. And so she made that a really major campaign about making Seattle affordable to poor people, not only poor black people, poor people of all ethnic groups.
We had class about China and the USA yesterday, and I want to know, what do you think that the Trump administration is related with the military tension involved with China, or this could be just a demonstration of power?
So it's a very interesting question. I thought during the campaign that maybe the Trump administration was saying we want to be allied with Russia, and China, which is much more of a growing economic power, is a threat to the United States. And in fact, you know, many of the people who were behind the Iraq War with the United States that began in 2003. It's called Project for New American Century. They said the real threat to the United States power is China. And so, you know, in the campaign there was a lot of propaganda about China with the currency, that they have their currency undervalued to sell the goods, which is not true at all. But it's a very mixed thing, you know. So on the one hand, there's a lot of rhetoric against China, but then China and the United States are so involved economically. To me, China is another capitalist power that's not a progressive country at all. So it's a very mixed thing. I think there's conflict, you know, and danger, but at the same time, there's a lot of economic cooperation. Like China holds a lot of U.S. dollars, which is very important for the U.S. economy. And then I am actually very, very worried about the war with North Korea. That the United States, if North Korea is a very poor, weak country, and the United States attacking it to gain support. And China, to me, at least there, has played a very, very positive role. And maybe because the United States doesn't want to go with China, the United States is basically a bully. They want to fight countries that are very weak. And that China's been important, I think, stopping of the United States being even more aggressive toward North Korea. So I think it's a very mixed relationship. I could see increasingly scapegoating, saying China's the cause of the problems. That has not happened so much. It's happened a little bit, but the anti-Chinese rhetoric or the words from the administration have been somewhat limited. They were bigger during the campaign, but since January, that's decreased a little bit. So I don't know, I think what do you think about it? Because I don't know, it's a good question. And I think it's a very important question, but I don't know so much. You have any thoughts? Okay. To be continued.
Hi, Peter. There is some debates that connect terrorism to the tightening of surveillance, and I was thinking that maybe these social movements may be tightening surveillance into. Can you talk about that, please?
Okay, so I think that's a very important question I did not deal with enough in my talk, so thank you for asking the question. Okay, like I mentioned, the United States from certainly the 40s through the 70s or 80s, the anti-communism was so much used about if you oppose the United States, like if you were, for example, for civil rights, like the black movement was also often called communist. And through that, there was huge surveillance of people. Like, for example, there was a movement called COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program. I was a victim of it, where, you know, many people were killed. They divided people. They spied on people. So that was very much, the surveillance was a very major part of the United States. Many, many people, thousands lost their jobs for being called communist. So what's happened, I think after the 70s, there was a lot of the exposing of the surveillance and the infiltration, and it decreased. It got, in the late 70s, it decreased somewhat, but with the growth of the terrorism threat that you talk about, the surveillance has really increased. It's new forms. The surveillance that I was victim of was often people who worked in groups I was in who made believe they were progressive, but they were really working for the FBI or the police or the military. You still have that today, but you have a really increase of the wiretapping, the phones, the computers, and it's very, very dangerous. So when I said the growth of authoritarianism, this growth of surveillance under the guise calling it anti-terrorism is really, really major. And I think to build movements, we need to figure out ways of dealing with that better, because often, you know, it's getting so much information. People are afraid about losing their jobs. I mean, again, the more we can, you know, learn to support each other so that people cannot be isolated and attacked, the more important. And so often, like somebody mentioned with the Antifa, right, calling them terrorists. I think like a lot of the environmental justice groups in the United States, for example, I saw the people who are against the Dakota Access Pipeline, the pipeline I mentioned, there's now a call to say they're terrorists, environmental terrorists. And many people I've known who maybe they did a little bit of property damage, they were called environmental terrorists and had many, many years in prison. So I do think this idea of terrorism, surveillance, it's a very, very dangerous combination. We should not overestimate it, because some people I know, they use that to justify doing nothing. I think the more people we have work together, the more we can oppose it. I think we need to expose it. And to me, people like Edward Snowden, people who openly reveal what the US government is doing in surveillance, they're really heroes. And I'm sure it goes on in Brazil. I mean, in Mexico, I was just recently in Mexico, and yeah, there was this surveillance program that was kind of Israeli-US companies where basically they could get every single thing on people's phones. So like, I know people are telling me when they have meetings out in Mexico, people always leave the phones far away from any meetings, and these often were groups, nothing illegal was being discussed, but journalists, I think this idea of surveillance, it's important we don't exaggerate, make it worse than this, because that's the way people would say, I'm afraid to do anything. But I do think we need to talk about it. And, when I suffered, I've suffered a fair amount of repression from the government, and I think it's very important that and maybe I was too much trying to get left people support me. I think we need to get liberals, people who believe in civil liberties, to build a large united front against a surveillance state and not allow the government to decide to call terrorists, to work for justice, not being a terrorist.
One more?
One or two more, maybe
Okay,
one.
okay.
Maybe one, two more.
Okay.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
I was wondering if you could talk a little, or explore a little bit more about how the situation during the Obama administration could lead us to the rise of racism that you have today. Because I understand that racism is nothing new. You had racism in America for as long as we can understand. But at the same time, you have a black president in a society that try to deal with racism. And when you change from Obama to Trump, kind of rise different type of racism. So I was wondering what kind of elements or what kind of structures developed during this Obama administration that could lead to the type of racism that we have today.
Okay, so again, not to go too long, I think the United States before the 1960s, you could say, was maybe a little bit like the apartheid system in South Africa. We called it Jim Crow, where the laws openly discriminated. A lot because of the movements of the civil rights, black movements, Latino movements. We have a situation where the open racism, the laws, to most extent ended, not fully. So it's a system what I call formal equality, but real inequality. And then when Obama becomes president, like I said in my talk, I think to many people, the view is we have a colorblind society. Look, we have a society that race doesn't matter. And look, you have these black news people, you have even black heads of corporations, you have a black president. And therefore, if you have poverty, it must be the fault of African Americans. So that's what I meant by colorblind racism. I think Obama was a living proof to many people, look, the system is not racist, therefore demands, what I call for equality, was seen as demands for advantage. So together with, many, many white people having a difficult time economically, right? Because, for example, incomes, the average incomes of white people, for most white people, have not increased in 40 years. They stayed about the same. So I think believing, look, we don't have a system that's racist, all these demands, by the Black Lives Matter movement, they use the term, which to me is a racist term, the idea of reverse racism. The idea of reverse racism is the idea that black people have an advantage. When people say that to me, I say, okay, do you want to switch? And I think with the Obama thing, it was a proof. And then again, the whole, not just saying it's Trump, it's so much, his whole campaign that Obama's not born in the United States, called the birther thing, or that he's a Muslim, I think was very much feeding into a racism that always exists in the United States, but since many people thought it was over, it's very easy to rise again. So I think people not having their needs met, And Obama really, I think, he really, in terms of really meeting the needs of African Americans, poor people, what he did was really, really limited. It wasn't zero, but inequality stayed. For example, with the prison, he did begin some investigations of very racist police departments, like in Seattle, where I live. All of those have been overturned by Trump and Sessions, but they still weren't very significant. But see, again, the rhetoric, like Fox News was, it's the black president for black people. I think he was so afraid to do more for racial equality that he both didn't do the problems, but it's furthered this idea of racism in a period where a lot of people are very, very angry what's going on. And I was trying to say in my talk, I think our challenge is to see how important racism is, but at the same time, talk about economic justice, but not just talk about the 1% who run the country, combining racial, gender justice together with a view of equality for all. Maybe what you said. Maybe, is there one last question or we can stop? Any last questions or comments?
I'll put up really, really quick question myself,
Okay,
but
great.
really quick.
Okay,
Just,
okay.
just
Last-
because we still have a last one. Otherwise,
Okay,
I wouldn't do that.
Go for it. Go ahead.
You mentioned so many examples, and that was so rich for us to listen about resistance and about your optimism with the future organization of these movements. And now you were just talking about economic justice, not only in racial terms, but also in economic justice for the 90%. So a quick question, it would be if you see continuities and articulations that go back to the Occupy Wall Street movement, and if you see a continuation of that mobilization in 2011 to this new wave of articulations against Trumpism, and that would be that.
Okay,
Thank you.
so, first, in terms of working to change society, I often say, I don't know if they'll win or not, but I can look myself better in the mirror if I try than if I don't try it. So that's part of it. But then, beyond that, and I don't think Brazil is so different, by the way, but that's a whole other discussion, is that the Occupy movement was not successful in winning any changes, but the idea that we live in a society that's obscenely unequal in income and wealth, and that's the idea of the 99 and 1%, really resonated with so many people. It didn't lead to any kind of institutional changes, but those ideas continue to exist in the population where, for example, issues of economic justice have become much more central. And so to me, I think there's a very clear link, even if there were very weak institutions, the Occupy movement had a lot of problems, and I was very involved in doing education within those movements. But I think there's a very direct connection between the Occupy movement of 2011 and the Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016 and so on, of where, again, this issue of economic justice have really become to the forefront. What I was trying to say, I guess, and this is the contradiction, I think this idea of 99% is really powerful, but it has to be done in a way that says we have to unite, but not just unite against the 1%. We have to unite, but in a unity that makes issues of climate, environment, gender justice, LGBT, racial justice part of it, even if that divides some. Otherwise, I think some people say, we got to appeal to the most conservative white worker. Not all white workers are conservative. So my view is to unite the 99%, but on a platform of a different society that really includes and makes central the needs of the most oppressed, but includes everybody, but puts at the center those who are most oppressed in the system. And I think Brazil has many of the problems in closing. I think the United States, there's so many people who are really dissatisfied, know something is wrong, and I think our challenge is to really go out, to work with people, to build movements that this idea of, socialism or barbarism or destruction or with the possibility of liberation is really there, and it's worth the fight.
Thank you very much, Peter,
Thank
for
you.
being here.
Thank
And
Who stayed. Thank you, Tara, very much.
e obrigada também, mais uma vez, aos colegas da Federal da ABC, enfim, aqui os professores Flávio, Olympia Barbante, coordenador do Núcleo de Estudos Estratégicos em Democracia, Desenvolvimento e Sustentabilidade, que foi um dos parceiros no evento, a professora Tatiana, coordenadora do Bacharelado em Relações Internacionais, e tivemos ao longo da palestra também a presença de outros colegas, então quero agradecer muito a parceria de vocês com isso.